It was a Sunday morning, the kind that promised calm, routine, and perhaps a quiet cup of coffee on a sunlit patio. But for the Reiner family, December 14th, 2025, would become anything but ordinary. By the time the day was over, two lives would be violently ended, a young man would be in police custody, and a family's world would be irrevocably shattered. Can you imagine walking into a home where everything seems normal? Rooms arranged perfectly, the faint smell of breakfast lingering in the kitchen, and discovering that your parents are dead, victims of a horrific act of violence? For Rob Reiner, that nightmare became reality. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Romy was just 27, the youngest daughter in the Reiner household, yet the weight she bore that morning would age her beyond her years. According to reports, she was the one who found the bodies of her parents, Rob Reiner's father, 78, and Michelle Reiner, 70. What she saw defies easy description. Investigators would later describe the scene as one of extreme violence, a brutal reminder that even in the most seemingly secure and affluent homes, danger can exist right under your nose. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of street violence. This was intimate, personal, terrifying in a way that could make anyone question their entire understanding of safety, trust, and family. Before the grim discovery, the day started quietly. Neighbors would later recount seeing Romy arrive at the estate, moving with purpose, a sense of urgency that hinted at her awareness that something was wrong. She had reportedly grown concerned about her brother, Nick. Something about his behavior, something she had sensed for months, had unsettled her. But what could she have done? How could anyone anticipate a tragedy this sudden, this devastating? And yet, those nagging instincts are often the first signal that a storm is coming, even if the storm's magnitude is unimaginable. Once Romy entered the home, she made the discovery that would change her life forever. The details of what she encountered are chilling, yet they are essential to understanding the full scope of this tragedy. The police, responding quickly to her call, described the scene as one of absolute carnage. Multiple sharp force injuries had claimed both lives. The manner of death was homicide. There was no denying the brutality. Each wound, each detail, pointed to a violent struggle, a deliberate act of destruction. And at the center of this storm was someone close, someone who should have been a protector rather than a predator. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Police officers arrived, forensic teams began documenting every inch of the estate, and news of the tragedy began to spread through the local community. Rumors circulated almost immediately. Neighbors speculated about motives, friends of the family expressed shock, and social media lit up with speculation and disbelief. How could this happen? People asked, not yet knowing that the accused was a member of the family itself. The combination of wealth, celebrity status, and familial betrayal made this story irresistible to the public eye, but unbearable for those living it. Romy's role that day cannot be understated. Not only was she the first to find her parents, but she also acted quickly, contacting authorities and providing details that would later become crucial in the investigation. In her call to the police, she reportedly described a dangerous family member and insisted that suspicion should be placed carefully, implying that the threat was internal, not external. Such presence of mind is almost inconceivable under ordinary circumstances, yet she managed it while grappling with shock, grief, and fear. As investigators began to piece together the timeline, a narrative of the morning emerged. Nick Reiner, 32, lived in a guest house on the Reiner estate. The relationship between him and his parents had reportedly been strained, though details were initially murky. Friends and acquaintances described a young man who, on the surface, seemed ordinary, yet beneath that exterior, tensions simmered, tensions that may have escalated to an unthinkable degree. By the time police reached the main house, it became evident that the events leading to the murders were deliberate, and that the violence had been concentrated, targeted, and tragically intimate. Meanwhile, Rob Reiner's siblings, Tracy and Jake, were beginning to grasp the magnitude of the situation. Calls were made, family members were gathered, and the reality began to settle like a heavy fog. Two beloved parents were dead, and the suspected perpetrator was someone they all knew. For Tracy and Jake, The horror was compounded by the intersection of private grief and public scrutiny. News crews, social media, and neighbors created a pressure cooker of attention, each piece of information dissected, debated, and broadcast. There is little solace in grief when the entire world seems to be watching. The media frenzy began almost immediately, fueled by the high-profile nature of the family and the shocking circumstances. Headlines were unrelenting, social media threads grew by the minute, and rumors began to circulate. Some speculated about mental health struggles, others about long-standing family conflicts, and still others wondered if there had been prior warning signs that were ignored. It is in these moments that the private and public collide, forcing families to confront both loss and the relentless intrusion of external judgment. Investigators continued to collect evidence, focusing on Nick as the prime suspect. According to police reports, the timeline suggested that the attacks occurred in the early hours, with the bodies discovered later that morning by Romy. The cause of death, multiple sharp force injuries, pointed to a brutal and personal act. Detectives examined the guest house where Nick resided, looking for clues, any sign that could indicate motive, premeditation, or instability. In these early stages, the picture was incomplete, yet the trajectory of the investigation suggested a deeply disturbing reality. This was no spontaneous outburst. At the same time, questions began to swirl around the dynamics within the Reiner household. Nick's relationships with his parents, his siblings, and his broader social circle were scrutinized. How did a family that appeared so harmonious, so public-facing, harbor the potential for such tragedy? Were there signs that friends, neighbors, or family members had missed? And if so, how could something so catastrophic unfold despite warnings, instincts, or prior concerns? These questions, initially rhetorical, would soon demand answers as the investigation deepened. Even as law enforcement began to secure the scene, the human toll was impossible to ignore. Romy, the discoverer of the bodies, had to navigate the dual burdens of grief and responsibility. Tracy and Jake were forced to confront a reality that defied comprehension. And behind the scenes, Rob Reiner himself, though a public figure known for poise and control, faced the unimaginable, reconciling the loss of his parents with the knowledge that his own son stood accused of their deaths. There is a human frailty in these moments that is difficult to convey. 1 minute, life proceeds as expected. The next, it is transformed into a narrative of horror that no one could have scripted. And then, as the investigation progressed, details emerged that would escalate the shock. The very fact that Romy had warned authorities about a dangerous family member took on new weight. Had the tragedy been preventable? Were there warning signs that went unheeded, or signs that no one could have acted upon? The interplay between instinct, foresight, and the inevitability of fate creates a tension that runs throughout this story, one that will echo through every chapter of this unfolding tragedy. By the evening of December 14th, the estate was swarming with law enforcement, forensic experts, and investigators. Every room, every hallway, every detail was meticulously documented. Nothing was left to chance. The focus, of course, was Nick Reiner, the son who had been living on the property and now faced the full weight of suspicion. How a 32-year-old could allegedly commit such acts, how a family could endure such an assault from within, became the central questions gripping both investigators and the public alike. In the days that followed, the story would expand beyond the confines of Brentwood. News outlets detailed every known element. The ages of the victims, the charges against Nick, the discovery by Romy, the initial forensic findings, and the early reports of potential motive. Social media amplified every rumor, speculation, and theory. The Reiner family, already grappling with grief, now faced the crushing weight of public attention. For many families, such scrutiny is unbearable. For the Reiners, it was an additional layer of pain, highlighting the tension between private sorrow and public curiosity. As the first chapter of this tragedy closed, one chilling reality was clear. The events of December 14th were only the beginning. The discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies set off a chain reaction, investigative, legal, emotional, and psychological, that would unfold over weeks, months, and years. Romy's role as the discoverer of the bodies, the early warnings she had voiced, and the immediate police response would all factor into a story of grief, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of answers. Family. It's supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of love, trust, and shared history. For most, it's the first source of comfort and security. But what happens when the very people who should protect you become a source of fear or danger? For the Reiners, this question wasn't hypothetical. It became a horrifying reality. To truly understand the tragedy of December 14th, 2025, we need to delve into the intricate dynamics of the Reiner family, a web of relationships, expectations, and hidden tensions that would, tragically, shape the events of that fateful day. At the center of it all were Nick Reiner, 32, and his parents, Rob Reiner's father, 78, and Michelle, 70. On the surface, the family appeared typical, even enviable. They had wealth, status, and the trappings of Hollywood success. The estate in Brentwood, a sprawling $13.5 million property, reflected a life of comfort and security. Friends and neighbors described the Reiners as close-knit, caring, and deeply private. But appearances can be deceiving, and the cracks beneath the polished surface were growing wider than anyone realized. Nick, according to accounts from family acquaintances, was a complicated individual. Some described him as quiet, introspective, even reserved. Others noted a tendency toward mood swings, moments of irritability, and behaviors that raised concern. The very characteristics that might seem innocuous in one context, sensitivity, volatility, introversion, can become dangerous when combined with other, darker impulses. The Reiner household, though outwardly calm, was reportedly a place where these traits created tension, friction, and sometimes fear. Romy, the youngest daughter, was acutely aware of these dynamics. She reportedly had concerns about Nick long before the tragedy unfolded. Family friends and sources close to the investigation indicated that she had occasionally voiced unease about her brother's behavior, hinting at instability or aggression that could escalate under certain circumstances. These were not idle complaints or sibling squabbles. They were warnings, subtle but real, about a potential threat within the family. Yet, as often happens in families, these warnings were either minimized, rationalized, or left unaddressed. How often do families dismiss warning signs in the hope that things will blow over? Tragically, in this case, those hopes would be brutally shattered. Tracy Reiner, Rob's sister, played her own role in the family dynamics. She was known for her composure, her intelligence, and her attempts to mediate conflicts within the family. In the aftermath of the murders, her grief was layered with shock and a profound sense of disbelief. For Tracy, the tragedy was not just the loss of her parents. It was the realization that the person accused of taking their lives was someone they had welcomed into their home, someone they had trusted implicitly. Jake Reiner, Rob's brother, faced a similar emotional paradox. He loved his family deeply, yet he was now confronted with the possibility that a family member, a nephew, had allegedly committed the unthinkable. The cognitive dissonance of loving someone who may have caused irreparable harm creates a unique and painful psychological tension. How do you reconcile grief for loved ones with fear, anger, and even betrayal toward another family member? The Reiners would have to confront these questions head-on, navigating a labyrinth of emotion that no amount of fame, wealth, or public support could simplify. At the heart of the family dynamic was the relationship between Nick and his parents. Investigators noted that, while outwardly cordial, there were undercurrents of conflict and tension. Small disagreements that might have been trivial in other households apparently carried greater weight in the Reiner home. Reports indicated that Nick had a history of volatile interactions, sometimes escalating minor disputes into intense confrontations. Whether these were early warning signs or merely typical familial friction is a question that would dominate the investigation and the public imagination alike. Interestingly, neighbors and friends reported moments of apparent normalcy that contrasted sharply with the tragedy. They described family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and everyday routines that seemed ordinary, even joyful. This juxtaposition is critical in understanding the horror. From the outside, the Reiners seemed like any other successful, loving family. But inside the walls of the estate, a different reality existed, a tension that no casual observer could see, a volatility that would erupt in violence. The complexity of the Reiner family also extended to their broader social circle. Hollywood families often operate under intense scrutiny, and the Reiners were no exception. Pressure from public perception, expectations of success, and the constant balancing act of private versus public life may have exacerbated underlying tensions. It's difficult to quantify how much influence external pressures had on the internal dynamics, but in high-profile families, these factors cannot be dismissed. Imagine living under a microscope, where every action is analyzed, every misstep magnified. For a young man already struggling with emotional instability, the stress could be overwhelming. Romy's perspective, in particular, offers insight into the family's internal world. As the one who discovered the bodies and voiced concern to authorities, she had a unique vantage point. Friends described her as perceptive, empathetic, and fiercely protective of her family. Yet even her instincts, powerful as they were, could not prevent the tragedy. Her warnings to police about a dangerous family member reflect a clarity that only hindsight can fully appreciate. How did she perceive the danger? What did she notice that others did not? These questions are central to understanding the layers of family tension that culminated in December 14th. Nick's relationships with his siblings also warrant attention. While public records and reports provide only glimpses into their interactions, sources suggest a mixture of affection, rivalry, and occasional estrangement. Sibling relationships are complex, often oscillating between love and conflict. In the Reiner household, these dynamics may have amplified the stressors within the family, contributing to an environment where conflict could escalate tragically. The interplay of sibling rivalry, parental authority, and individual temperament creates a volatile mix, one that, in this case, had devastating consequences. Another critical aspect of the Reiner family dynamic was the interplay of accountability and denial. Families often struggle to confront uncomfortable truths about their members. The tension between love and fear, loyalty and responsibility, can delay action until it is too late. In this case, Romy's intuition clashed with the family's collective hope that things would remain under control. That clash between instinct and expectation is a recurring theme in tragedies of this nature. The warning signs were there, faint but discernible, yet human nature often leads us to ignore them until the consequences become unavoidable. The Reiner's public persona adds yet another layer of complexity. Hollywood families live under a dual reality: their private lives and their public image. Maintaining appearances, meeting social expectations, and navigating fame can mask underlying problems. Friends and neighbors saw the Reiners as composed, successful, and intact. But appearances, as we now know, can be deceiving. Beneath the polished exterior lay unresolved conflict, emotional volatility, and, ultimately, the seeds of disaster. Understanding these dynamics is not just about reconstructing a timeline or listing grievances. It's about recognizing the human elements at play: fear, resentment, love, and betrayal. It's about acknowledging that tragedy often emerges from the interplay of ordinary human flaws magnified under pressure. In the Reiner household, these elements converged in a way that would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. As investigators continued to piece together the family's relationships, it became clear that Nick's alleged actions were not just a crime. They were a rupture of trust so profound that it would redefine the meaning of family for the Reiners forever. Every interaction, every subtle tension, every unheeded warning now took on a new significance. Questions that had previously seemed minor or speculative, arguments over money, past disagreements, hints of instability, became crucial pieces of the puzzle. By the end of this chapter, one chilling realization emerges: the Reiners' tragedy was not solely the result of one act. It was the culmination of complex relationships, subtle warning signs, unaddressed tensions, and the unpredictable volatility of human behavior. Families, no matter how loving or successful, can harbor the potential for conflict and, in rare cases, catastrophe. For Romy, Tracy, Jake, and the wider Reiner family, December 14th, 2025, was the day that those underlying dynamics erupted in the most devastating way imaginable. But the story is far from over. What happened next? Nick's arrest, the legal implications, and the emotional fallout would propel this tragedy into uncharted territory, where public scrutiny, media frenzy, and the dark realities of the prison system would intersect with the family's grief in ways that no one could have predicted. The night of December 14th, 2025, began with a sense of disbelief and horror that few could have imagined. By the time the evening descended over Brentwood, Nick Reiner, 32, the son of Rob Reiner's parents, was in police custody, facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrests themselves are often portrayed in news headlines as simple procedural events. A suspect is taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported. But in cases like this, the arrest represents far more than paperwork and legal procedure. It is a seismic moment, the pivot around which grief, fear, public fascination, and legal consequences all collide. The circumstances surrounding Nick's arrest were swift and decisive. After Rob Reiner discovered the bodies of her parents and alerted authorities, the investigation moved quickly. Police considered the family member warnings seriously. Witness statements, prior concerns, and evidence from the estate all pointed toward the young man who had lived in the guest house on the property. According to law enforcement sources, Nick was taken into custody that very night, under the shadow of suspicion that would soon become formal charges. First-degree murder is a serious accusation. It implies premeditation, intent, and the deliberate execution of a violent act. It is not levied lightly, and the legal consequences are severe: life imprisonment without parole, or in certain jurisdictions, even capital punishment. In the case of Nick Reiner, prosecutors allege that the murders were calculated, targeted, and committed with a deliberate intent that made the act particularly horrifying. But what drove a 32-year-old son to commit such an act against his own parents? That question would dominate the investigation and the public imagination, forming a recurring theme throughout the months that followed. Eyewitnesses and neighbors described the moments leading up to and following the arrest with a mix of disbelief and fear. It was difficult for anyone outside the immediate family to comprehend the psychological and emotional layers of this situation. Imagine standing across the street from a house you've admired for years, knowing that the events inside have shattered lives in the most unimaginable ways. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of wealth and stability, now became a crime scene, a testament to how fragile human relationships can be when pushed to extreme limits. Nick's demeanor at the time of his arrest was reported as calm but detached, a chilling detail that immediately raised questions about his state of mind. Was he aware of the gravity of the situation? Did he comprehend the loss, the devastation, the lives he had allegedly taken? These are questions that investigators and psychologists would struggle to answer in the days and weeks that followed. While law enforcement focused on evidence, the family faced the unthinkable reality of seeing someone they had raised, someone they had loved, labeled a murderer. The charges themselves were filed with precision. 2 counts of first-degree murder carry specific legal weight, reflecting not only the severity of the alleged acts, but also the intent behind them. The prosecution argued that the evidence indicated premeditation, that Nick had contemplated, planned, and executed the murders with deliberate intent. For legal observers and members of the public alike, this painted a grim picture. First-degree murder is the most serious classification of homicide in the criminal justice system, reserved for acts that are both intentional and thoroughly planned. In other words, prosecutors were alleging that this was not a spur-of-the-moment crime. It was a calculated act of family betrayal. Beyond the immediate legal definitions, the arrest and charges had ripple effects. The Reiner family was forced to confront not just grief, but anger, confusion, and fear. How could a son allegedly plan and commit such an act against his own parents? Could there have been warning signs that were missed, overlooked, or ignored? Romy, who had previously expressed concern about Nick's behavior, likely found herself grappling with guilt and a haunting sense of what if. How often do we dismiss small signals, only to face consequences that cannot be undone? The Reiners now lived within that terrifying reality. At the same time, the public and media reaction intensified. Headlines screamed of Hollywood tragedy. Reiner family murder shocks Los Angeles. Nick Reiner arrested in brutal family slaying. Son accused of killing parents on $13.5 million estate. Social media exploded with speculation, conspiracy theories, and theories about motive. For many, it was impossible to reconcile the public image of the Reiners with the violent events being reported. How could a family associated with success, charisma, and Hollywood prestige harbor such darkness within its walls? This cognitive dissonance fueled both fascination and horror, driving the story into national consciousness almost immediately. Meanwhile, the legal machinery moved forward with efficiency. Arraignments, hearings, and preliminary investigations began in rapid succession. Nick faced the daunting reality of legal scrutiny, where every action, every statement, and every interaction would be meticulously analyzed by law enforcement and legal experts. Defense attorneys would likely explore issues such as mental health, family dynamics, and potential triggers, while prosecutors focused on premeditation, motive, and the overwhelming evidence of violence. The courtroom, in essence, became a second stage for the drama that had already played out inside the Reiner estate. Psychologists and criminal experts weighed in on the case, offering their interpretations to a public desperate for understanding. They highlighted the complexity of familial homicide, noting that while rare, cases where children harm their parents are often fueled by a mixture of psychological stress, unresolved conflict, and underlying instability. In Nick's case, the combination of wealth, family prominence, and complex interpersonal dynamics may have created an environment where small fractures escalated into irreparable rupture. Experts repeatedly asked the same question. How does a son, someone expected to protect and cherish his parents, turn into the alleged source of their destruction? As the legal process unfolded, another unsettling reality emerged: the potential dangers awaiting Nick inside the prison system. High-profile prisoners, particularly those accused of violent crimes against family members, face unique risks. Inmates often view parricide as especially heinous, and individuals accused of such crimes can become targets. Reports began circulating suggesting that Nick might not survive incarceration, that the environment awaiting him was as perilous as it was punitive. For the Reiner family, this created a harrowing paradox. They grieved for their lost parents, but also faced anxiety and fear for a son accused of unspeakable acts. Could they mourn fully, or was part of their emotional energy consumed by concern for someone responsible for so much pain? In parallel, investigators continued to dig deeper into the events leading up to the murders. They examined phone records, prior disputes, behavioral patterns, and witness statements. Every interaction, every argument, every sign of potential instability was scrutinized for clues. This painstaking process revealed small contradictions, subtle signs of escalating tension, and hints that the tragedy might have been anticipated by those closest to the family, particularly Romy. Her warnings to authorities, once perhaps dismissed or overlooked, now took on heightened significance. The arrest also raised profound ethical and emotional questions. How does a family reconcile love with accountability? How do you grieve while grappling with anger and fear towards someone you raised? These questions are rarely discussed in public discourse, yet they form the core of what the Reiner family faced. Friends and acquaintances noted the tension and complexity of emotions that defined the days following the arrest. There was grief, certainly, but also confusion, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal that could not be easily articulated. Even the legal process itself magnified the emotional stakes. Every court date, every filing, every statement became a reminder of the tragedy. The Reiners were thrust into a dual reality: private mourning on one side, and the relentless exposure of their family's darkest day on the other. Public interest, fueled by the family's prominence, ensured that no aspect of the case remained private. Each development, no matter how procedural, was analyzed, broadcast, and debated. And then came the looming reality of the future: Nick's potential fate in prison. Reports of threats, violence, and hostility toward accused parricides added a new layer of tension. The family, already devastated, faced the grim possibility that Nick might not survive incarceration. How do you grieve for lost parents while fearing for the life of a son accused of their murder? The emotional complexity is staggering, and it highlights the unique horror of this tragedy. It is simultaneously a story of loss, accusation, and an uncertain, precarious future. By the end of this chapter, the arrest and formal charges of Nick Reiner have set the stage for a series of emotional, legal, and psychological battles. The story moves beyond the immediate horror of the murders into an intricate web of consequences, questions, and fears, both for the accused and for the family trying to navigate a reality that defies comprehension. Rob Reiner, at just 27 years old, found herself at the epicenter of a nightmare few could imagine. She had walked into her family home on that December morning, expecting routine, comfort, perhaps even laughter, and instead encountered unspeakable horror. For most people, discovering the violent deaths of one's parents would be an almost paralyzing experience. For Romy, it became a defining moment, one that would shape not only her understanding of her family, but her perception of life, trust, and the fragility of the people we think we know best. From the outside, Romy had always appeared composed, articulate, and empathetic. Friends describe her as perceptive, fiercely protective, and intuitively aware of the moods and behaviors of those around her. Yet, even these qualities, which often provide stability, could not shield her from the sheer shock of what she witnessed. The moment she discovered her parents' bodies, she was thrust into a situation no one could have prepared her for. The estate, with its sprawling gardens and polished interiors, became a crime scene. Each room she passed, each step she took, echoed with the gravity of what had transpired. Her world, once secure and predictable, was shattered in an instant. According to reports, Romy had previously expressed concern about her brother, Nick. She had warned authorities that he was dangerous, implying that he could be a suspect in any future incident. These warnings, often dismissed or underestimated, now took on an almost prophetic significance. It is a tragic reality that intuition, even when voiced, is sometimes ignored until the consequences become catastrophic. Romy's instincts had been right. She had sensed the potential for violence, yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of the moment. Imagine the emotional weight of that realization. That your family's darkest fear has materialized, and that the person responsible may be someone you once loved unconditionally. The psychological impact is profound. Survivors of family trauma often experience a spectrum of emotions: grief, guilt, anger, disbelief, and fear, often all at once. For Romy, these emotions were magnified by the intimate nature of the crime and the public scrutiny that followed. Her role as the first responder within her family's tragedy placed her in an impossible position, carrying both the grief of loss and the responsibility of reporting it. As investigators arrived at the estate, Romy was faced with the dual burden of cooperation and mourning. She provided detailed accounts of the morning, describing what she had seen and what she had suspected. Her testimony would later become a cornerstone of the investigation, offering crucial insight into the family dynamics and the potential motives behind the murders. Yet while law enforcement focused on evidence and procedure, Romy grappled with the private horrors of her discovery, the intimate, personal knowledge that her parents had been brutally murdered by someone within their own household. The emotional spikes in Romy's experience were stark and unrelenting. She faced the immediate shock of the deaths, the fear of potential threats, the anger at her brother, and the profound sorrow of losing her parents in such a violent manner. These emotions were further complicated by her public exposure. As part of a high-profile family, every statement, every action, and every visible response was scrutinized by the media and the public. There is little solace in grief when it is constantly measured, analyzed, and judged. Romy's suffering was deeply personal, yet it unfolded in a context that amplified every emotion to almost unbearable levels. Psychologically, Romy's situation illustrates the complex interplay between trauma and resilience. She was a witness, a survivor, and a participant in the early stages of the investigation. Each role demanded a different set of emotional and cognitive resources. Survivors of family violence often struggle with feelings of guilt, questions of, could I have prevented this? Or did I do enough? And Romy was no exception. She had voiced concern about her brother, yet the tragedy had still occurred. This juxtaposition of foresight and helplessness can create a haunting sense of responsibility, even when the survivor's actions were entirely justified. In addition to the psychological weight, Romy faced practical challenges. She had to interact with law enforcement, provide accurate statements, and assist in the reconstruction of the crime scene. At the same time, she had to navigate her grief, support her siblings, and begin to process the reality of her parents' deaths. Each decision, each word, carried significance, both legally and emotionally. The pressure was immense, the stakes extraordinarily high, and the environment emotionally charged. Romy's perspective also sheds light on the subtle warning signs within the family dynamic. Friends and neighbors later described her as unusually attentive to tensions within the household. She had noticed behavioral changes in Nick, moments of aggression or withdrawal, and had attempted to voice her concerns to adults she trusted. These observations, often overlooked in ordinary family life, became tragically relevant in the context of the murders. Romy's awareness highlights a recurring theme in cases of familial homicide. Intuition and subtle signals are often the first indicators of danger, yet they are rarely heeded with sufficient urgency. Her grief was further complicated by the media coverage that followed. For a young woman in mourning, constant headlines, social media speculation, and public commentary can be both invasive and distressing. Every article, every post, every theory reinforced the reality of the tragedy while stripping away privacy at a time when intimacy and personal space are most needed. The Reiners, already navigating an unimaginable loss, were now also dealing with the scrutiny that accompanies fame. A dual burden that intensified every emotional spike. Beyond grief, Romy's role as a survivor demanded resilience. Survivors of violent family trauma often face long-term psychological challenges, including post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression. The process of navigating these emotions while participating in an investigation requires a unique combination of strength, clarity, and adaptability. Romy's ability to articulate her experiences, provide accurate information to authorities, and continue to function in the immediate aftermath speaks to her resilience, but it does not diminish the profound emotional toll. The human element of Romy's experience cannot be overstated. Imagine standing in the room where your parents lived, loved, and laughed, now transformed into a scene of violence. Imagine balancing the desire for justice with the instinct for forgiveness, or grappling with the paradox of loving someone accused of unimaginable acts. These are the challenges Romy faced daily, compounded by her youth and the intensity of the events. Her perspective offers a window into the raw, unfiltered reality of familial tragedy, a perspective that goes beyond headlines and police reports to reveal the complex emotional landscape of a survivor. Romy's story also underscores the theme of foresight and missed opportunities. Her warnings to authorities about Nick being dangerous were not heeded in a way that could have prevented the tragedy. This aspect of the narrative highlights a painful truth. Even the most perceptive individuals cannot always prevent catastrophe, especially when the dynamics involve complex family relationships, emotional denial, or the hope that conflicts will resolve naturally. Romy's foresight, while tragically insufficient to stop the event, nevertheless provides crucial context for understanding the emotional and psychological undercurrents that shaped the tragedy. As the investigation progressed, Romy's testimony became central. Investigators sought to understand the family dynamic, the relationship between Nick and his parents, and the behavioral patterns that might have contributed to the events of December 14th. Her insight offered clarity, yet it also reinforced the depth of loss, grief, and betrayal she had experienced. Each detail she provided, each observation she recounted, became part of a larger narrative that would inform both legal proceedings and public understanding. By the end of this chapter, it is clear that Romy Reiner is not just a witness, but a survivor navigating the most extreme consequences of familial tragedy. Her perspective illustrates the emotional complexity of losing parents to violence, the weight of prior warnings, and the burden of public attention. She embodies the intersection of grief, resilience, and responsibility, a lens through which the broader story of the Reiner family can be understood. In the shadow of December 14, 2025, Tracy and Jake Reiner faced a reality no sibling should ever confront. The violent loss of their parents and the accusation that their own brother, Nick, was responsible. For most families, grief is an intensely private experience, navigated within the walls of home and shared only among those closest. But for the Reiners, a family with deep ties to Hollywood, fame, and public recognition, their grief would be anything but private. Every expression, every movement, and every statement would be scrutinized by the media and dissected by the public. The interplay between public perception and private mourning became one of the most challenging dimensions of their tragedy. Tracy Reiner, Rob Reiner's sister, has always been recognized for her composure and diplomacy. She has navigated the public eye with grace, balancing the demands of celebrity with a desire for privacy. But December 14th shattered any semblance of normalcy. In the immediate aftermath, Tracy was thrust into a vortex of emotion. Sorrow for her parents, shock at the alleged involvement of her nephew, and the need to support her younger sibling, Romy, who had discovered the bodies. The combination of grief and responsibility can be paralyzing, yet Tracy found herself performing both simultaneously, forced to act with clarity in the midst of emotional chaos. Jake Reiner, Rob's brother, faced a similar emotional ordeal. While not as public-facing as Tracy, he was intimately connected to the family and deeply invested in both the investigation and the emotional well-being of his siblings. Like Tracy, Jake had to navigate the tension between private grief and public scrutiny. Every interview request, every media inquiry, and every passing comment in public became a test of emotional control. How do you mourn a profound loss while under a microscope, knowing that the world is analyzing your every tear and gesture? The Reiners had to learn quickly that their grief would never remain their own. It would be a public narrative, dissected and debated endlessly. The dichotomy between public and private grief is particularly pronounced in high-profile families. For Tracy and Jake, there was the expectation to maintain composure in public while simultaneously processing trauma in private. On one hand, the public looked to them for statements, insight, and explanation. On the other hand, they were mourning deeply personal and private losses. This tension can create profound emotional strain, leading to an exhausting oscillation between outward poise and inner turmoil. Imagine balancing the performance of control with the raw vulnerability of grief. Every step, every word becomes a negotiation between authenticity and societal expectation. Tracy and Jake also faced the complex task of navigating their relationships with Nick in the wake of the allegations. Family ties are rarely severed cleanly, and the accusation that a sibling committed murder introduces a devastating emotional paradox. How do you reconcile the love and memories you shared with someone who may have caused unimaginable harm? How do you balance accountability, justice, and familial loyalty? These questions haunted the Reiners in ways that were both deeply personal and publicly visible. The media and social commentary amplified every uncertainty, every hesitation, and every attempt at composure. Reports suggest that both Tracy and Jake were deeply concerned with Romy's well-being during this period. She had been forced to confront the violence directly, and the responsibility of being the first to discover her parents' bodies weighed heavily on her. The siblings acted as both supporters and shields, attempting to protect Romy from further trauma while also grappling with their own emotional responses. The delicate balance of providing care while managing one's own grief added another layer of complexity to their experience. Psychologically, the Reiners' situation illustrates the multifaceted nature of grief in cases of familial homicide. Unlike sudden or accidental deaths, this scenario is complicated by betrayal, fear, and the potential danger posed by a family member. The mind struggles to reconcile love with anger, loyalty with fear, and loss with betrayal. Tracy and Jake, like Romy, had to navigate this treacherous emotional terrain while maintaining a semblance of stability for both themselves and their younger sibling. The cognitive dissonance created by loving a family member accused of murder is profound, leading to long-term emotional and psychological challenges that often require careful support and therapy to navigate. The public aspect of their grief was relentless. Media outlets reported extensively on the Reiner family, highlighting every known detail about the tragedy. Every family outing, every statement to law enforcement, and every interaction with friends and neighbors was scrutinized. Rumors and speculation abounded, creating a feedback loop of public pressure and private pain. For Tracy and Jake, managing this dual reality became a full-time endeavor. Their private mourning was constantly interrupted by the glare of public attention, amplifying every emotion and magnifying the stakes of each decision. Additionally, the siblings had to confront the broader implications of the tragedy. Beyond personal grief, there were considerations of reputation, legacy, and public perception. The Reiners had spent decades cultivating a family image of stability, success, and talent. The murders threatened to redefine that narrative entirely, replacing admiration and respect with curiosity, scandal, and, for some, judgment. Navigating this intersection of grief and public perception required extraordinary emotional resilience and strategic thinking, even as they continued to process their profound loss. Tracy and Jake's grief was further complicated by the ongoing legal developments surrounding Nick. His arrest, the charges, and the media coverage placed the family in a state of constant tension. Every court proceeding, every legal filing, and every statement from prosecutors or defense attorneys forced them to confront the reality of their loss anew. The legal process, by its very nature, prolongs the emotional trauma, as hearings and updates serve as repeated reminders of the tragedy and the alleged role of a family member. For siblings, this prolonged exposure to stress and grief can be psychologically taxing, leading to both acute and chronic emotional strain. Yet amidst the turmoil, Tracy and Jake also demonstrated resilience. They supported each other and Romy, managed public appearances with dignity, and maintained a focus on the ongoing investigation. Their actions highlight the complexity of coping mechanisms in situations of extreme familial trauma. Balancing emotional authenticity with public composure is no small feat, and their ability to navigate both spheres underscores a remarkable, if deeply tested, strength. The contrast between private grief and public expectation also illuminates the societal pressures faced by high-profile families. While private mourning allows for introspection, reflection, and intimate support, public grief introduces judgment, expectation, and constant observation. Tracy and Jake were forced to grieve on multiple fronts simultaneously, a reality that magnified their emotional burden and tested their endurance. By the end of this chapter, it becomes clear that Tracy and Jake Reiner's experience exemplifies the duality of grief in public life. They were mourning deeply personal losses while navigating the relentless gaze of the public and media. Their love for their parents, their concern for Romy, and their conflicted emotions regarding Nick created a complex, multi-layered psychological landscape, one that is central to understanding the broader human dimensions of the Reiner family tragedy. Once Nick Reiner was taken into custody, the investigation into the murders of Rob Reiner's parents intensified. What initially appeared as a shocking domestic tragedy began to evolve into a complex web of evidence, revelations, and unanswered questions. Law enforcement, forensic teams, and investigators approached the Reiner estate with meticulous precision, knowing that in high-profile cases, every detail could be scrutinized, every clue dissected, and every misstep magnified. The pressure was immense, not only because of the brutality of the alleged crime, but also because of the family's prominence, which brought the weight of public expectation and media attention. From the outset, investigators focused on reconstructing the timeline of events leading up to the murders. Romy's early statements were crucial, as she provided insight into both her parents' last known interactions with Nick and the broader family dynamics that may have contributed to the escalation of tension. Police examined Nick's guest house, the main estate, and surrounding areas for any evidence that could explain the motive or confirm the sequence of events. Every room, every surface, and every item was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed. Forensic evidence painted a chilling picture. The cause of death for both Rob Reiner's father and Michelle Reiner was listed as multiple sharp force injuries, and the manner of death was ruled homicide. Each injury, each mark, told a story of intense violence, pointing to a deliberate and personal attack. Investigators analyzed blood spatter patterns, weapon placement, and signs of struggle to reconstruct the actions that led to the parents' deaths. The meticulous documentation would later become central to court proceedings, but it also revealed the raw, terrifying nature of the crime. One of the early questions for investigators was motive. Why would Nick allegedly commit such a heinous act against his own parents? Motive in cases of familial homicide is often layered, combining personal grievances, psychological instability, and complex family dynamics. In the Reiner case, investigators explored a range of possibilities. Unresolved conflicts, financial disputes, long-standing emotional tension, and potential mental health struggles. Each avenue offered insights, yet no single explanation seemed to fully account for the magnitude of the alleged violence. Investigators also examined Nick's digital footprint. Phones, computers, and social media accounts were analyzed for communications that could provide context to his behavior, emotional state, and potential premeditation. Text messages, emails, and online activity offered a glimpse into interactions with family, friends, and others in his social circle. While digital evidence alone could not determine guilt, it provided critical context for understanding relationships, moods, and potential triggers. Another focal point of the investigation was eyewitness testimony. Neighbors reported unusual activity in the days leading up to the murders, though nothing overtly criminal. Friends described subtle changes in Nick's demeanor, moments of withdrawal, tension, or unexplained anger. While these observations were initially anecdotal, investigators used them to build a more complete picture of the environment in which the tragedy occurred. Even small behavioral shifts can be significant when combined with forensic evidence, timelines, and family accounts. The investigation also revealed contradictions that raised further questions. Some family friends and acquaintances noted that Nick had previously appeared close to his parents, participating in family events and celebrations. Others observed tension and disagreements that suggested underlying friction. Investigators had to reconcile these conflicting accounts, analyzing each statement for accuracy, consistency, and relevance. This process is painstaking, but in high-profile cases, precision is critical, both to ensure justice and to withstand the scrutiny of public attention. Physical evidence within the estate became a central component of the investigation. Investigators cataloged items that had been displaced, rooms that showed signs of struggle, and objects that could potentially be linked to the alleged crime. This level of detail allowed forensic teams to create a comprehensive reconstruction of the events, providing both law enforcement and later the public with a clear, if horrifying, understanding of what transpired. Every item, from a misplaced knife to a disturbed piece of furniture, offered clues that could illuminate the timeline and behavior of those involved. Mental health experts were also consulted as part of the investigation. They assessed Nick's psychological profile, considering factors such as behavioral patterns, past incidents, and potential triggers for violence. Understanding the mental state of a suspect is critical in cases of familial homicide, as it can inform both legal strategy and the interpretation of evidence. Experts examined whether there were signs of pre-existing conditions, acute stressors, or emotional triggers that could have contributed to the alleged acts. While the investigation could not definitively answer these questions, expert analysis provided a framework for understanding behavior within a complex emotional and familial context. Media coverage further complicated the investigation. With each revelation, speculation intensified. Social media threads dissected every aspect of the case, from the alleged motive to the family's history, creating a parallel narrative that both reflected and amplified public curiosity. For investigators, maintaining focus amidst this noise was essential. Every statement had the potential to influence public perception and, in some cases, future legal proceedings. Balancing transparency with investigative integrity became a critical challenge. Throughout this process, Romy's statements continued to guide investigators. Her insight into family dynamics, her observations of Nick's behavior, and her first-hand account of discovering the bodies were invaluable. Investigators cross-referenced her statements with forensic evidence, digital communications, and witness testimony, seeking consistency and patterns. Her perspective helped to clarify the sequence of events, highlighting both the emotional and physical realities of that morning. As the investigation deepened, new revelations emerged. Reports suggested that Nick had a history of behavioral issues that had previously gone unaddressed. While these incidents were not violent to the extent of the murders, they indicated a potential pattern of volatility. Friends and acquaintances described moments of emotional instability, tension with family members, and occasional confrontations. Investigators considered these factors as part of the broader context, recognizing that understanding past behavior is often critical in interpreting present actions. The legal implications of the evidence collected were profound. Prosecutors were tasked with building a case that demonstrated both intent and premeditation. Each piece of evidence, from forensic analysis to digital records, needed to support the charges of first-degree murder. Meanwhile, the defense had to navigate a complex landscape, potentially exploring mental health issues, family dynamics, and alternative interpretations of the evidence. The tension between these legal strategies highlighted the broader challenges of familial homicide cases, where emotional complexity intersects with legal rigor. By the end of this chapter, the investigation had transformed from an immediate response to a sophisticated, multifaceted inquiry. For the Reiner family, the process was both illuminating and agonizing. Each new revelation brought clarity, but also intensified grief, fear, and uncertainty. The complexity of evidence, combined with the high-profile nature of the case, ensured that every step of the investigation would have profound consequences for both the legal outcome and the family's emotional recovery. But as investigators continued to dig deeper, they would uncover details that no one could have anticipated. Clues that would not only shape the case against Nick Reiner, but also reveal startling truths about family relationships, psychological patterns, and the devastating consequences of overlooked warning signs. Once the investigation solidified its findings, the focus shifted to the legal arena. Nick Reiner, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, faced not just public scrutiny, but a complex and high-stakes legal battle. For families in such circumstances, the courtroom represents both hope and terror, a place where truth may finally be revealed, yet also a stage for reliving trauma under relentless examination. For the Reiners, preparing for what would become a trial of intense emotional, legal, and societal significance demanded a careful balancing act of legal strategy, family support, and emotional endurance. The charges of first-degree murder are the most serious in the criminal justice system. They indicate premeditation, intent, and planning, suggesting that the alleged acts were deliberate and calculated rather than impulsive. In practical terms, this elevates the stakes for both prosecution and defense. Prosecutors would be tasked with proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Nick acted intentionally, while defense attorneys would explore avenues such as mental health, family dynamics, and potential mitigating circumstances. Every piece of evidence gathered during the investigation, from forensic analysis to digital communication records, would play a pivotal role in the courtroom drama to come. For the Reiner family, the legal preparations were emotionally exhausting. Romy, as the youngest sibling and the one who discovered the bodies, would likely be called upon to provide testimony regarding her observations, her warnings about Nick, and her understanding of family dynamics. Tracy and Jake also faced the challenge of engaging with legal proceedings while managing their own grief and public exposure. Every deposition, interview, and court appearance required a degree of composure that often contradicted the inner turmoil they were experiencing. In essence, they were preparing to relive the tragedy while under the weight of both emotional and legal scrutiny. Legal experts emphasize that familial homicide cases are uniquely challenging. The combination of intimate relationships, emotional stakes, and public attention can complicate both the gathering of evidence and the presentation of arguments. In the Reiner case, attorneys on both sides had to navigate these complexities with extreme care. The prosecution needed to construct a narrative that convincingly demonstrated premeditation, while the defense explored avenues that could contextualize Nick's alleged actions, potentially invoking mental health concerns, emotional stressors, or familial tension as mitigating factors. Pretrial preparations involved extensive collaboration between investigators, prosecutors, and expert witnesses. Forensic analysts reviewed every piece of physical evidence, ensuring that each element could withstand scrutiny in court. Mental health professionals evaluated Nick, providing insight into his psychological profile, behavioral patterns, and potential cognitive or emotional triggers. Legal teams meticulously reviewed witness statements, cross-referenced timelines, and strategized for potential counterarguments. The preparation process was exhaustive, designed to anticipate every possible line of inquiry, challenge, and objection. At the same time, public attention added a layer of pressure. Media coverage of the Reiner family tragedy had already been intense, and anticipation of the trial ensured that every development would be broadcast, analyzed, and debated. For the family, this created a dual reality: navigating the intricate legal landscape while managing the intrusion of a relentless public gaze. Every statement, every reaction, and every court appearance could be misconstrued or sensationalized, amplifying stress and emotional vulnerability. One of the central legal debates likely involved the question of motive. First-degree murder requires evidence that the accused acted with intent and premeditation. Prosecutors would need to demonstrate not only that Nick committed the acts, but that he had a deliberate plan to carry them out. Evidence of behavioral patterns, prior conflicts, and digital communications could all be pivotal in establishing motive. For the defense, challenging these interpretations or providing context could be equally critical, potentially introducing arguments related to mental health, emotional stress, or family dynamics as factors influencing behavior. Mental health evaluations would likely be a central component of the trial preparations. Psychologists and psychiatrists would assess Nick for indicators of emotional instability, potential disorders, or acute stressors. These evaluations would serve multiple purposes: informing defense strategies, providing insight into behavioral patterns, and assisting the court in understanding the psychological landscape that may have influenced the alleged actions. The intersection of mental health and legal strategy is complex, often requiring careful navigation to balance accuracy, advocacy, and ethical considerations. Witness preparation was another key element of trial readiness. Romy, Tracy, and Jake, along with friends, neighbors, and other family acquaintances, would need to provide consistent, credible, and emotionally coherent testimony.